Another clip just came out from John MacArthur's Master's College about how women should suffer in an abusive marriage similar to how missionaries should endure persecution. In this video, we'll be reacting to a series of videos from John Street, the chair of the graduate program of biblical studies at John MacArthur's Master's College and an elder at GCC. This brings up some questions I have about the sanctity of marriage versus the idolization of marriage. This also brings up some questions about how we approach the scriptures. Are we consumed with the letter of the law or the spirit of the law? So I'm gonna play you guys some of the video, we'll react to it together, and I got a quote from John MacArthur that may seemingly put him in opposition of one of his own elders on this topic. Make sure you watch till the end.
Ruslan.
This is Dr. John Street, Master's Seminary. He is one of the elders at GCC, and a clip came out from the Roy's report of him saying some pretty sketchy, questionable stuff. At the end, I'm actually gonna read a quote from John MacArthur and an alternative view to all of this. So let's just jump right into this.
But we don't agree that the primary goal of the counselee or the counselor working with an abuse situation is to make personal escape and protection the essential object of their counsel. Virtually, at this point, there's no difference between integrationalist counselor and the secular counselor. Both have the same goal, that is, ultimately saving the body.
He opens up with saying, hey, the difference between biblical counseling, which is what he is the head of, and secular counseling is that secular counseling positions the body as the primary force in terms of saving a woman who is in an abusive situation, and he doesn't believe it should be this way.
That if saving the body is the ultimate goal in counseling, to be consistent, we would have to make that the ultimate goal of Christians across the board.
Listen to where he takes this.
So that would mean a lot of our missionaries who are in locations around the world where they are under bodily threat, we're going to have to pull them home and put them in a protective situation because husbands, wives, children are under bodily threat. What does that say about Christians in countries like China, where the church is openly abused and physically harmed? Maybe we should do everything we can to pull and smuggle those people out of China, undergoing persecution all the time, some of them dying.
Out the rip, what he's paralleling is he's saying, listen, the issue with secular counseling is that they're prioritizing the physical protection of someone as the ultimate priority. Well, no. See, we as Christians, we can't apply that logic because then we'd have to apply that logic to missionaries, and missionaries are putting themselves in harm's way. Now, to be clear, some missionaries definitely put themselves in harm's way. There's certain folks that maybe are in countries that are hostile to Christianity. However, I would say yes, if you could pull Christians from violent situations, you probably should give them the option. And this to me is telling of a deeper mentality that I think some of these folks have in terms of this obsession, dare I say, with persecution. Hey, we're going to lose on earth and they're going to wipe us out. It's kind of connected to eschatology, and it really is, in my opinion, a very unhealthy way to view the idea of being martyred. So then when you're thinking about, oh, I'm a missionary for Jesus and I'll lay down my life, that sounds really romantic and sexy, but when you actually play that out to its logical conclusion, you are then like excited for any hint of persecution or suffering, that you will take this really twisted logic and apply it to other areas like marriage, which is not the same. I'm not a Calvinist, okay? So some of you guys are gonna be like, well, you have a bias against John MacArthur and Master's Seminary or Master's College because you're not, okay. My buddy Dean did a video from the perspective on this very topic. When we factor in everything that's came out with the Eileen Green situation, you start going, okay, this is kind of some of their framework. It's an obsession with persecution. It's an obsession with suffering. It's an obsession with losing on earth instead of living lives that are going to flourish on earth.
Then those people shouldn't be there. We should take no risks at all.
See, this is a false binary, and he's positioning it as if you're just concerned about people's well-being, then you should never send missionaries out. No, there's a spectrum here. It's not either or. There's a wide spectrum of views that you could have towards willing to put yourself, yes, in potentially dangerous situations. Hey, going on a mission trip to parts of Mexico could be dangerous. Yeah, people go. Versus, I'm going to be in a position where I'm dangerously positioned to potentially get physically harmed and lose my life.
But that's the ultimate goal.
So it's the ultimate goal. It's not the ultimate goal. I wouldn't say that my ultimate goal is for me to never endure physical harm. No, I would say it's a pretty high goal, though. Like, I'm not gonna do things recklessly because I can just to position myself to be hurt. It's not the ultimate goal, but it is a priority for most of us who are trying to follow Jesus. I think this is a deeper issue. And again, you guys, Calvinists, you guys can push back on this. Johnny Mac fans can push back on this. I think the deeper issue is this influence of Gnosticism that's crept in from the likes of people they look up to, like John Calvin, who was really influenced by Augustine, that takes a very low view of the material, physical world and takes a very high view of spiritual things. And so even though John MacArthur could be rather successful, he could be, own multiple homes, have an $11 million net worth, he'll still say things like, we suffer down here we lose. And it's like, brother, you are doing very well. Maybe you should be equipping young men on how to do better on this side of eternity, ignoring the fact that Jesus came as what? Fully God and fully man. Jesus was both, that we are people who are going to be what? We have a soul, a spirit, and a physical body. That when Jesus comes back, he's going to what? Restore a new heaven and a new earth. That it is both physical and spiritual. I'm gonna give you guys an alternative view, and we're gonna read a question from Johnny Mac here in a second, but let me play another clip from you guys.
Is it wrong for a wife to separate from her husband? Or, for that matter, a husband to separate from an unbelieving wife?
So is it wrong for a wife to separate from her husband? And then watch kind of how he double talks here.
Yes, if her goal and purpose is to just simply get out of the trouble.
What does that mean? What trouble are we talking about? Are we talking about a tumultuous situation where there's some conflict and she doesn't want to deal with conflict, she doesn't want to go to mess? Or are we talking about physical harm?
Her goal must be first to please God. She needs to be with him, or he needs to be with her, in order to win their spouse over to righteousness. Sometimes it means hardship.
Okay, sometimes it means hardship, yes. Hey, listen, I would agree that marriage isn't designed just to make you happy. It's also designed to make you holy, okay? I agree with that. Sometimes it's hardship. But listen to what he says next.
Sometimes it means abuse.
Sometimes it means abuse. This is always the risk. So now we're moving away from experiencing hardship in marriage to being okay with experiencing abuse. No. And it starts making sense. This is what's being taught by the head of the Master Ceremony Biblical Counseling Program. This isn't that long ago. I believe some of these clips are from 2012.
Nobody wants to see that at all.
Okay, well, I'm glad you guys don't want to see that. Okay, we all agree there.
The answer is also no.
So he says the answer is also no, so meaning that he is allowing some approach to get out of the situation.
If she is convinced, from a prudent standpoint, as we saw in Proverbs chapter 22 and verse 3 and Proverbs 27:12, that her husband is out to kill her, there's no longer any desire for him to live as a husband with her. He basically has abandoned all of his husband's provision, protection. We would say this: a dead testimony is no testimony at all.
So when you just bury your head in the sand and you ignore the secular world, secular counseling, secular therapy, because you think it's bad because they're not Christian and they don't really know how to do it, but by golly, we know how to do it. You ignore what the actual research shows, which is that oftentimes in these situations, things can escalate. And sometimes they can escalate rather quickly. Sometimes somebody being very verbally abusive and demeaning can turn into slapping or little physical contact, grabbing and shoving someone. That can escalate to somebody being punched. That could escalate to somebody being beaten. Is this a camp that is taking things from the scriptures in such a literal fashion that they're not approaching it as what is the spirit of the law with regards to not divorcing and why is that there and what is the context of that, and the letter of the law of what Jesus says, and how did Jesus even communicate about other issues? And so I wanted to highlight this view from Pastor Mike Winger, but I wanted to highlight this because I think this gives an alternative view based on scripture on how we could approach divorce and remarriage.
Radical danger or harm justifies separation and divorce. Have you not read what David did when he was hungry and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God and he ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests. So the principle seems to be, well, David's life is in danger. He's being chased by Saul. He needs food to continue on his journey and save his own life. And Jesus seems to be approving of his eating of the showbread, but there's a law against it because this is an exception to that law. Matthew 12 verses 5 through 7. Or have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath, the priests of the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless, right? Because they're laboring in the temple on the Sabbath. This is interesting, isn't it? They profane, but they're guiltless. And then he goes on to explain the principle they didn't understand. He says, I tell you something greater than the temple is here. And if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. When a woman leaves or flees, or a guy, because of abuse of themselves or of the children, and they have to get out of Dodge, to tell them that they are required to stay faithful to that marriage and to not divorce and to stick with that person, I think it condemns the guiltless. And I think that it's violating the God desires mercy and not sacrifice principle. Matthew 12:11, it says, which one of you has a sheep? If it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will take hold of it and lift it out. And of course they would. They would all have done that. And then he goes on to say, of how much more value is the man than the sheep? The exception here is about human life and human health. And that's what the abuse issue is all about. According to Instone Brewer and Craig Keener, the Jews of the time would have assumed there were exceptions to any rule that Jesus had given. And it's consistent with compassion. And perhaps that's what Paul meant when he says we're not enslaved. We're not talking about making marriage a slavery situation. It's not meant to be that. And so in such cases where marriage is becoming slavery, we are not enslaved.
Marriage is not a slavery situation. John MacArthur, maybe some of the theology that's coming out there kind of teaches that. Maybe it doesn't teach that. I'm going to look at a quote from John MacArthur himself regarding the situation. But I wanted to give you guys something that's been really useful to me. And it's an approach to scripture, an approach to these different things that I think could be beneficial to us. This is the Wesleyan quadrilateral approach. Okay, now John Wesley, some of you guys know, he didn't design this. It was designed based on some of his writings, where we can say, okay, scripture is that little gray thing that enthralls everything that's happening, right? That's the scripture portion of it. But if you look, you also have the blue, which is reason, common sense. Hello. If you allow someone to stay in a situation that could potentially escalate, you will then potentially put them in some serious physical harm. So we use wisdom in terms of just common sense, reason, the expertise of professionals. You also have the tradition. This is more towards in terms of like approach to scripture, approach to tradition, church scripture, church history, that sort of thing. And then you have Christian experience. We could look through our own experience, how we've all experienced God move in certain specific ways, so on and so forth, past experiences, right? But scripture is what guides all of this. If we're honest, regardless on what camp you're a part of, we all approach following Jesus with the scriptures as the circle, and then we use reason and common sense. And then some people use tradition more than others, right? Depending on what camp you're in. If you're, an Armenian Orthodox, tradition is very important to you. If you are a Calvinist, maybe tradition isn't as important to you, but you're definitely reading Edwards, and you're definitely reading Calvin, and you're definitely reading Luther, and you're definitely letting those things gleam into your existence, into your approach. And then you have experience, which is, hey, let's look at church history. Let's just use our experiences. Let's engage these things. However, scripture becomes the circle that guards all of that. This is helpful in terms of how we could approach this idea of common sense, reason, logic, and scripture guides that. And we're not abandoning scripture. No, we're staying to scripture. We're just allowing things like natural law, which was coined by St. Thomas Aquinas, to guide some of these things and think through these things critically. This is where it gets confusing. And I think if John MacArthur's ultimately the head of Master's College and GCC, and there seems to be some double talk and dissenting views, he needs to be extremely clear about this. And here's his response about women staying in abusive relationships. He says, divorce is not always an option. Either scripture does not automatically permit divorce in the case of a physically abusive husband. Still, while scripture does not specifically instruct the battered wife, it gives principles that certainly apply to her. And then it says, God gives us wisdom, this is what I'm saying, to be defensive and cautious. We duck when something flies through the air at our heads. Right? He's literally saying what I just said to you guys. Common sense tells us to avoid situations where we're placed in physical danger, and I believe that is what God expects of us. So it's interesting that in some of his writing, he's seemingly contradicting the very things that some of the elders in his church are teaching. He goes on to say, a woman whose husband brutalizes her, there's no virtue in a wife's willingly submitting to beatings and physical abuse from a cruel or drunken husband. And certainly there is no biblical warrant for a woman knowingly to allow herself to be beaten and even injured in the name of submission to her husband, especially if there are legitimate steps she can take to avoid it. Clarity brings confidence. I don't know what John MacArthur's position is on this exactly. Here, it sounds like he's agreeing with me. His head of biblical counseling sounds like he's in a whole nother stratosphere with the way he's approaching this. I don't know which one is the official position. Sounds like a lot of double talk. Sounds like they don't really know what the left hand isn't telling what the right hand to do. And I think this ultimately is on John MacArthur in the sense that, yes, he may not be prescribing this himself, and there might be these quotes and a sermon clip here. However, it doesn't mean that he's not responsible for what's coming out of Grace Community Church and the culture that's being bred there with how women are being treated, how abuse victims are being treated, the stuff that's coming out from Master's College. It's ultimately his responsibility, even though it may not be directly his fault. I don't know. This video was inspired by the article from Julie Roys, who's had some wild things said about her. If you guys want to check out the crazy, bizarre case against Julie Roys, be sure to check out this video right here. All right? Peace.